Hello, my name is Colin Riddington and this is the latest in my series of Isle of Dogs on Access videos, and today I'm going to talk to you about a subject that I've been passionate about for many years, and that is to make automatic form resizing work for you. And this is a presentation that I gave recently to the Access DevCon conference, and it's a slightly modified version of that. There is a page on my website with all of the resources that go with this presentation, and you can download those from isleofdogs.co.uk using AFR. Now, for those of you who aren't aware what automatic form resizing is, it's something that you can use to adjust your forms to fit your whatever size and resolution screen you've got now. And you might want to do that if you've got some legacy apps where the text is now far too small to read at the high resolutions that we tend to use today. Alternatively, you may have an app where it was designed in a higher resolution than the monitor that you're using, and you're finding yourself having to scroll horizontally or vertically in order to see all the information. You may have tried some other alternatives. Layouts and anchoring are the most common ones that people use, but if, like me, you found they give poor outcomes, I think you may be pleasantly surprised by what this can do. The typical problem that people will have if they distribute an app to many users, then those users may have different screen sizes. Some will have laptops, some will have desktops, some even may have tablets. They'll have different form factors in terms of the shape of the screen, horizontal to vertical, and also the resolutions used. And even if they work now, you may find your client base either have recently changed or will soon be changing their monitors and likely the resolution with that. And you don't want to keep updating your app to actually fit every single time those changes occur, so you want to ensure that that will stay perfect for future use. In any case, even if most of your users have no problems, some users may have eyesight issues and may need to zoom their screens, and that is also possible with automatic form resizing. But although it's something I think should have been built into Access from the very beginning, and I've been using automatic form resizing myself for well over 15 years, you might not find it useful if all your users have exactly the same monitor size and resolution. I have never been in that fortunate position, but maybe you are. But are you sure that that will always stay the same in the future? So to give you an idea of then what it can do, here's a form that I'm going to show you actually later in the demonstration here with lots of different size controls and far too small to read any of the information on there. After resizing, then everything has been enlarged and resized and repositioned proportionately. It all just works. So what happens with automatic form resizing then? As I've just mentioned, then the forms are automatically resized to match the user's screen size and resolution, and all the objects are repositioned proportionally on the form as it is resized, and their form objects and their contents are also resized proportionally, with all the fonts being enlarged by the right scaling factor. If you move to a different monitor, either automatically or at least on a button click, the resolution or scaling has been changed, it will resize to fit. Doesn't matter whether you use overlapping windows display, which I prefer, or the newer tab documents display, both work. And all the available forms will also work. Single forms, continuous forms, pop-up forms, split forms, and even the navigation form will work fine. And in the last couple of years I've finally managed to get Datasheet forms to work with this as well, and it also works when the application interface is hidden and you've got a form floating on the desktop. Those are the standard features there, but you've also got an optional zoom feature you can add to individual forms if you want to allow users to scale things up more or less to suit their own eyesight, and you've got an optional stretch shrink feature where you can resize on the fly. You'll be pleased to know it works in both 32-bit and 64-bit access without problems. And despite the complexity of the code behind all this, and it is complicated, you don't need to understand it all, but to use it you need one line of code at the very minimum in the form load event, and that is all one word, ResizeForm, and then me, where me stands for the form that is currently loaded. I will show you that code later on. So another example then. Here's a form in design view. It's got a photograph and a map, and after resizing then you can see everything has been enlarged to suit and is now readable. Here's a more complicated form. This one is a form with 11 subforms, each of which has been aligned perfectly to be underneath another form, to the left of another form, to the right of it, below it, and so on. Everything aligned perfectly in design view, and after resizing, everything is still aligned perfectly. And you can see here that everything fits exactly next to, above each of the subforms that it's meant to do there, with no gaps appearing there. Now, it's a very complicated form. Despite that, it takes less than a second to load that form, whether or not you've got automatic form resizing in use. And what I'm saying there is the time to actually do the resizing part is very, very fast indeed, a fraction of a second. You won't notice a delay due to the form resizing, even a complicated form like this one. Here's a zoom form, much simpler this time. It's just a simple pop-up form with a slider control and a combo box that allow you to adjust the zoom, and you can shrink it down if you want to, though more normally you'd be likely to enlarge it if you're going to use this effect here. And if it's a form where your users may be coming back to it regularly, they may wish to set the preferred zoom value for future use. So by ticking that checkbox, once they've got it to a value they like, then it will automatically reopen at that next time, and each user controls that individually. Here's the datasheet form. Here's a fairly standard situation where the text is very small then, and obviously even if that was filling the screen, it's still fairly small. And after resizing and with a small amount of zoom, then you've got a form now which is very definitely readable. But you can adjust the amount of scaling on that. The one thing that I've mentioned this here that doesn't resize, and that is Access gives you no way of adjusting the size of a checkbox, and it can't still be done with automatic form resizing. The split form, the only issue you've got here is that if you leave the splitter bar in place, that is the bar that governs the position between the top single section, in this case in the datasheet section, if you leave that in place, then once the form is opened, Access will actually want to save the form at that resized value. And if you click yes to that by mistake, then you'll find the form next time will be larger still, and you don't want that. So to avoid that happening, remove the splitter bar, just disable it in the property sheet, and you will find that this works every time. Navigation forms, not something I use. I find them difficult to work with in terms of the code. I make my own alternatives, but they work absolutely perfectly with one thing you need to bear in mind, and that is make sure that you don't have layout guides and anchoring in place as well as automatic form resizing. Use one or other, but never both. So if you remove them before you actually open your form in form view with automatic form resizing, it will work absolutely fine. With the application interface hidden, here's a boring form in design view, and here's the same form then floating on the desktop. Now, to do all that, you've got one module called modResizeForm, which contains nearly all of the code that I use in my applications here. At the top of that, in the declaration section, it's got three very important constants. In particular, the first one of those three, called design HortzRes, short for design horizontal resolution. And it's a long integer value, and that is normally set to be the horizontal resolution of the form when it is designed, such that if you want your forms to fill the screen, it does so at that resolution. Now, because I've been using this for so many years now, I still tend to use a value of 800 here in my forms here, so I get a lot of scaling up. It's always better to scale up rather than scale down, but you can choose whatever value you like. So if you're starting now, it's quite likely you might have 1680 or 1440 as your base resolution. So if like me you set it at 800, and if your resolution, like mine is now, is 1680 horizontally, then the scaling factor is 1680 over 800, which is 2.1, and that is the amount by which your forms will be enlarged horizontally and vertically in proportion, and all of their contents. And if that horizontal resolution is a different value, then the scaling factor will vary proportionally as well. There is a vertical version of that. It's only used in one place as a check. It's not particularly important that you get that right there, but if you want to do so, make sure that is the same vertical resolution as you're using when your form is designed there. And the third one of these I have never changed that, and I would suggest you don't do so unless you're absolutely sure that it's different in your monitor there. That's the number of pixels per inch, and that is normally 96. Leave it alone unless you're certain otherwise. Here's typical automatic form resizing code. In the form load event, then just one line of code, ResizeForm me. There may be other code in that sub as well, but that is the minimum you need to get resizing to work. If it's a subform, bear in mind a subform is a control on a main form, and so like every other control, it will be resized by default. So you don't normally want to resize a second time when you're using a subform here. So the first thing I do is then in the load event, I check whether it's being opened as a subform or a standalone form. If it's not a subform, in other words it's standalone, then resize it. Ignore that line here. To check that then, I'm using this code here, and it checks whether it's a subform or not, boolean, so it's true or false. If it's got a parent, then it's a subform. If it hasn't got a parent, it's a standalone form. So if it's a subform, don't do anything. If it's not, resize it. However, it is worth unresizing forms, subforms, when you close them, just as a double check. Not essential, but it's often worthwhile. Let's go on from here, and now let's look at automatic form resizing in action. Now, if you've seen any of my previous videos on this topic, you'll have seen a simplified version of this with fewer buttons here. I'm not going to go through every one of these, it will take far more than the time I've got available today, but let's start off by looking at the form that I showed you earlier on. Now this is a form which has got lots of different controls, as you can see, control types here, including checkboxes and text boxes and list boxes, subform, charts here. And just so you can see the resizing and how long it takes to do, then I'm going to click that button there, and you saw it took a split second to do. Normally, as I said, you do that on the form load event, and I will show you that on other forms later, but you get the idea here. And you can see that when I did that, then everything has been enlarged proportionately. It has been arranged that it will fill the screen vertically. By doing so, because I designed it in a 5x4 800 by 600 resolution, I've left some space at the right hand side there. If I'd used a widescreen resolution originally, that would also fill in that direction as well. On the screen I've actually got on the status bar what the current resolution is, 1680 by 1050, and you can see I've got that up there as well. Now I mentioned that there are three things that don't resize. Checkboxes cannot be resized in Access, nor can option group buttons. So in order to get a resizing effect with those, then what I do is I create a dummy text box and then use a Webdings or a Wingdings font that actually has the symbols that I want, whether it's checked or otherwise. Similarly for an option group buttons as well. And if we just go back to form view again and resize that again, then you can see then here's my checkbox, dummy checkbox, and here I've chosen to use colour. Not essential, but you can see that has resized proportionally. There's the standard option group, hasn't been resized. Here's the dummy option group, and again I've used colours. Again, you don't need to bother with the colour part if you don't want to do so, but it's easy enough to do it. The third thing that doesn't resize automatically, although buttons and text in those buttons there, the captions, will resize, the images that actually accompany buttons will not resize. And so although in design view they were the same size, in form view you can see that only the one that I've got at the bottom here has actually resized. Now to do that, what I've done is I've faked it, and that is I've got a whole series of different images, all the same image in fact, but just different sizes, and depending on the scaling factor it will then choose the appropriate image that will increase it in proportion to the original size there. So you'd have to be a very high resolution before that sort of size would be necessary. Okay, let's move on to the third form. Like all the other ones now, this actually then resizes on the load event. So I've got pretty much the same things that I had before, toggle buttons and so on. I'm not going to show you all of those then. Didn't mention the subform before, but you can see that these all work here. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drag this form nearly off screen to my other monitor, which uses a different resolution. And if I click that refresh button and then drag that back to my original screen here, afraid I can't show you it going from one to the other on this video here, you can see that my other monitor was 1920 by 1080 and it had resized it to fit that one. It's pretty much perfect as it is now, but if I refresh that now, you can see it's just shrunk it slightly further. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to change the resolution of my system here. So I've gone into Windows settings here and I'm going to change from my default 1680 by 1050 for this machine to 1400 by 9. And I do so. Now it hasn't actually yet refreshed because I haven't clicked the button there, but you can see it's too large for the screen. Refresh that and it shrunk it down and it's nearly perfect. Again, it fits in that direction perfectly. Slight problem with that there, I should have made that slightly larger here. Let's bring this back and now let's change that back to there. Refresh that again and it's come back to where it was before. Let me do it one more time, but this time what I'm going to do is change the scaling factor, and now I'm at 125% of 1680 by 1050. And when I drag this out of the way and click refresh now, you'll see that actually what I'm doing is effectively lowering the resolution to 1344 by 840. And again, I should have slightly adjusted the width of these to make it work for that thing there, but you get the idea of that. So you can, with a little bit of experimentation if necessary, and as you saw then, it gives nearly perfect results here. One more thing you can do on this form then is the zoom feature here. So I'm at 100% or standard resolution here. So for a user who's got a slight problem with their eyesight, then 105%, 115%, it will go off screen. It automatically brings in a scroll bar here. And if I prefer, I can do that with the slider, even bringing it down. Although normally you'd be making things larger, but you see it works in both directions. And I'll bring that back to 100% there. If I wanted to, as I mentioned earlier, save the zoom value for future use, checking that button there would make sure that form always reopens at that size. Here's a pop-up version of the same form with exactly the same effects. Now, one more form of this sort, exactly the same controls again. The only difference really is the change in background colour, but this one actually has the normal size that form load, but I've got a stretch or shrink feature as well, and you can see I'm now enlarging this on the fly, whereas on the other forms it's been designed that it will reach the maximum height and then stop. If I want to, I can enlarge this still further. So it's now going off the screen there, and you can see this current stretch factor is shown here. That's how much it's been multiplied compared to its original size. And I can also, if I want to, shrink that as well. But at the moment I've got a checkbox there which I'll just untick here. Now if I click this way, you'll see it works almost as well when shrinking, not perfectly. Things like scroll bars tend to get too big proportion and you may slightly lose things off screen at the bottom as well, but it is working pretty well. Again, although it's too small to read, you can it's got the scaling factor which is 0.5 or something like that. If you get very small, it doesn't work at all well and things definitely go completely out of proportion here, but luckily I've put that button in to bring it back to its normal size. But because it works very well in stretching, hasn't quite recovered that chart properly, it has now, works very well in stretching but less well in shrinking, I've got an optional setting here where if I tick that it will allow it to stretch as before, but what it won't do is allow me to shrink that below its original size. And that's something I recommend if you're going to use this stretch shrink feature. Okay, now I've also got a series of other things on here. I'm not going to show you them all, but I mentioned the datasheet form earlier before resizing. Let's now resize that. Much larger. You may find it slightly too large for you. Bring it back down again with the small zoom factor here, or I can unresize that and just use zoom on it, whichever you prefer. It also works if I use a standalone datasheet, but of course what I can't do is adjust the zoom, because you cannot put controls on a standalone datasheet form, and I only included the checkbox in here to show you the fact that you cannot resize those. Also, I never ever use table level lookup fields, but I've done that here just to show you that a combo box on a datasheet will also resize perfectly as well. Here's my split form with the splitter bar removed. Just show you that in the property sheet then. And on the property sheet then we've got split form, splitter bar, and I've changed that to no. So therefore I won't get prompted when it's resized. Bringing this back then, you can see it works perfectly. Navigation form with the layout guides removed, again, work perfectly. Alternatively, you can create your own emulated split form, which gives you additional functionality. It also allows you to not have to worry about splitter bars and so on, and you can also create your own emulated navigation form as well, which does the same thing. One more thing, although this is for form resizing, on rare occasions you may want to use a report as a subform, and when I actually change this, then it will resize the subform in the same way. Similar code for that purpose there. Let's come out of my app, although there's much more to it than that. That's shown you most of the things that you need to know about. For more detail, you can look at my series of articles on my website, and I'll give you the link for them later. To get the best results from automatic form resizing, I always recommend that people plan it from the start in their applications. Don't add it to an established application, because the results may not be perfect. Of course, the reality is the first time people actually want to use this, it's because they've got problems, and I'll show you that with existing applications in a minute. I always recommend you scale up rather than downwards. Get better results scaling up, not always perfect scaling down. Usually okay, but not always. Develop therefore in the lowest or base resolution of any of your users. So if you have some users at 1680 by 1050, and that's the minimum, use that as your base resolution. I supply with the app then various templates that you can use to match your base resolution to fill the screen at that resolution. Use them if you want to. Make sure you set that constant value, design halts res, in the modResizeForm to match that base horizontal resolution. I recommend you use maximize forms wherever possible, but it's not essential. Do take care with pop-up forms though, because if you over-enlarge them, because they're not tied to the application interface, they may go off screen and you may lose parts of those and find it difficult to bring them back again. Bear in mind the fact that 3 items can't be resized, but there's workarounds for each of these, as I've shown you earlier. Whatever you do, turn off layout guides and anchoring. Don't use both. I recommend, particularly if you're using zoom, that you leave some blank space at the bottom and right of the form as a precaution. Otherwise you may find that things get over enlarged or go off screen. In particular, tab controls and option groups should be kept nearer the top and nearer the left of the form to avoid the risk of oversizing. And that's explained in my series of articles. It's very rare it happens these days, however, because of the precautions I've built into the code. Whatever you do though, bear in mind that you can't get around the fact that at the moment there is a maximum form width in Access of 22.75 inches or 57.79 centimeters. Now recently they've announced that they are going to try and increase that, which would be excellent, but at the moment that is the maximum. So what the code does is, if the scaling factor would make your form want to be larger than that maximum size, it will scale up to that and then stop. It won't distort anything, everything just fits. Now, although that's what I recommend you do in terms of starting with new apps and build it in from scratch, it is possible to convert existing databases, and I'm going to show you 3 of these very quickly. Back in January, Carl Donabau did a presentation for Access Europe called Tips and Tricks, and he had one form that, when I looked at it, and he had one main form that was too large for my monitor. Carl had obviously designed it in a larger monitor than I was using, a higher resolution. Now it didn't look bad at all at the beginning here until I actually minimized the navigation pane and then realized there was some more information off on the right hand side. That was actually the most important bit because each of those acted as a different page for his tips and tricks. So in this case I need to actually scale it down a bit. So I'm going to go to the code here, and to save time I've already imported my modResizeForm, and here is the constants that I mentioned earlier. Now because my resolution is 1680 and it's obviously slightly too large for that, I assumed Carl had typed it at 1920, so I've set that constant to that value there. And now if I go to the form load event of this form that is open here, I've already put the line in ResizeForm me, but I haven't enabled it. Now I'll enable that. I'll save. I'll now close, and I'll reopen this. I could have just opened the form, but reopening from scratch. And you can see now it fits far better than it did before. It's not quite perfect here, but it's not far off. But I can adjust that slightly more. And if I now try a figure of 2000, it doesn't have to be a real resolution. It can be just a number that works for you. Though normally you would use a real resolution. Saved, close, and I'll just do it from here this time. And just minimize that. And now I've got nearly all of this. The form still doesn't quite fit, but that's because the text is slightly too large for that text box. The rest of the items on this app, by the way, work perfectly. So coming out of this then, I'll show you another one. And here's the more normal problem, and that is that you've got something that's too small. Now some years ago I created what I called a better date picker, and that was designed to be an improvement over the standard access date picker. In this one you can change the month and the year very easily, and I deliberately made it fairly small, except that the current date or the date that you've selected for your form then here will always appear slightly larger in a different font, and for most users that's absolutely fine. But I had a request recently to make the form slightly larger for the users of a particular database because they were finding it hard to read. Once again I've already imported the module. This time however, because I did this on my monitor when it was at 1024, that's the resolution I've set it to here. Now I'll go to the form date picker, and I'm going to go to the form load event. Lots and lots of individual controls there, one for each button there, and in here form load then ResizeForm me at the top. I'll enable that, save the code, and close that form here. And I'll click on this, and you can see now that the buttons and the form itself have all been enlarged, and the font in the combo box and so on, but with one exception, and that is the numbers on each of the date buttons haven't been. And the reason for that is after the form load event actually is done, and after the resizing has been done, there's a whole series of things to set the captions, the month names and so on, and all of that causes the form to redraw every single button. So doing this at the beginning actually isn't a good idea in this particular case. So I'm just going to disable that line, and now I've got an alternative position for that very close to the end, just before it repaints the form. So now we'll put it there and save that, and now close the form and click on that. You'll see now, yes, all of the numbers have been resized proportionally as well. So everything seems to be fine until you change month or year, and see it's redrawn all those buttons again because it's a different set of numbers there. So therefore I'm still not quite there. And the reason for that, if I just come out of this, the reason for that is that I need to do something extra still. So I'm going to actually undo that, go back to the beginning, and in here then, this date to elements there, that definition there includes another bit of code called draw date buttons, and that happens whenever you do any changes to the month the year and so on. And way down in that, there's one of the few times I did some hard coding, which as soon as I actually looked at this I regretted it. My fonts had been hard coded to be 8. I'm just changing that to be a constant called int font size, and this one now make it that +2. Now where is the int font size actually created? We're going back to my form load event again. Here the int font size says that it's actually going to be the font size of the first button, the very first one on the form there. So now save it and drag that out of the way, reopen it. Yes, fine. And now when we change month or year, everything works perfectly. Both of those fairly simple though. Here's a more complicated example. Now recently a new version of Northwind has been released, and it's an infinite improvement over the older versions. And possibly for the last time used in earnest, I'm going to show you how you can resize a complicated old database like Northwind 2000. And that has got many small forms of different sorts. I'm not going to read through all of these, but you'll be able to get the idea as we actually go through this. There's 21 forms, of which 13 have got code modules. None of them are maximized. 2 are resizable forms with datasheet subforms, resizable forms with continuous subforms, single forms, non-resizable forms, continuous forms, pivot table, dialog forms, embedded background images, photos, and a modal pop-up form. I'm going to show you now how I can alter that. It's an old MDB file, so I get a warning when I do this from PowerPoint here. And for those who haven't seen this then for many years, then this is the old Northwind 2000 database, okay, which has fairly small forms and low resolution images, as you can see here. Here's one with 2 subforms and so on there. That's what this looks like before I do any altering to it at all. I've already imported my modResizeForm, and I've got one other module I've imported as well, but this one I found out by trial and error was at 1024 back in 2000 here. And now if I go to my main form here, my startup, and I go to design view, the only code it's got is using functions and so on. It doesn't have any VBA in there at all, so it hasn't got at the moment a code module. I'm going to add that, and I'm going to type in Resize for me. Save that, close that form, and reopen that, and you can see it's enlarged it proportionally. Now that's fine, and I could do that for every one of these 21 forms in turn, but that's going to be a bit tedious to watch, so I'm just going to get rid of that a second here, and I'm going to go to my other module. I'll just close that form again. Go to my other module, and this has got code which is going to write in Resize for me and some additional code on every single form module, including ones that don't at the moment have a code module already created here. So it's going to go through then, and it's going to add the line Resize for me. It's going to also get some add some other code to allow the stretch shrinker feature to work and so on. Now I'm not going to go through that in term here, but just to show you then how long it will take me to do this. So it's going through every single form, adding that bit of code as necessary, and in just a few seconds then it's updated all 21 of those forms there. I've got a note to myself that I need to actually add something else for use with datasheet subforms. So let's have a look now then. Let's drag that out of the way. So as before then, the startup form works, and it's modal, so I just need to turn that off. Here's the categories form. I can't do anything about the quality of the image there, but you can see that everything's been enlarged proportionally. This one is resizable, and as you can see, everything is resizing quite nicely for that. Here's the customer labels dialog. It's not resized, sorry, it's not possible to stretch shrink that. It's a dialog form, but it's become enlarged here. Here's the customer orders form with 2 subforms here. And although there is some enlarging here, you see at the moment it's not responding to the stretch shrink event in terms of the subform size. I need to do some work on that, which I'll come back to. Customer phone list has been enlarged. Customers form with the background image, all working fine. Employees form with that a photo there of the supposed Nancy DeVolio. A main switchboard form. That one's not resizable in terms of stretch shrink. Another one with the datasheet subform products list here. I think that one is. Yep. And products, quarterly orders, another subform here. Sales analysis. This one's got a pivot chart in it. And you can see that's working as well. Of course, these days pivot charts aren't available in Access there. Another dialog form, and so on. Each of those has been enlarged, with the exception of the two forms with datasheet subforms. Now I need to do a little bit extra work for each of those here. Let's start off with the orders subform there. It's got that one subform, although it has actually enlarged that proportionally on load. What it's not doing is altering with the stretch shrink event. Orders, and I've got some code called maintain aspect ratio. Now at the moment that line is disabled. Now when I use this, then it will check what the original size is, it will then resize the form, and it will maintain the aspect ratio when I use the stretcher shrinker code. Now I just need to enable this procedure here. One more thing I need to do as well. I need to enable the same line, maintain aspect ratio, when I resize the form. And now when I go back to form view, hopefully, yeah, as you can see, everything enlarges. Let's do exactly the same on the customer orders form now. This one's got two subforms. I'll do it in the opposite order. I'm going to enable that line there, and enable that line there. Save that, and load that form, and as you can see, both of those have enlarged proportionately. I think you can see how quick and easy it is to use automatic form resizing even with fairly complicated items like the old Northwind database, and it will work with any other database in a similar way there. To give you some idea of the code I'm using, the resize code. Now this is the most important thing. Remember, ResizeForm me is put in the form load event of each form you want to resize, with some additional code in certain occasions there. And we start off then by checking what the monitor is in use and checking what its resolution is. We then get the scaling factor. This is used over and over again. Single number. Okay, the scaling factor then, right, is used for getting the base resolution, compare it with your current resolution, and it then says if the horizontal resolution is different to the constant set, then resize it. Obviously if it's the same size, then you don't need to do anything at all. You then go to this other separate code called resize, and you resize by that scaling factor. The first thing it does then is it increases the height of each section, okay, as well as the width of the form as a whole. So if you've got a header as well as a footer, increase those as well as the width, all proportionally. You then look at each control in turn, and you then enlarge them by the same scaling factor that's used up there as well. So for each control you move its left position, its top position, you increase it or reduce it occasionally by the scaling factor. You change its height and its width by the scaling factor as well. If you've got a navigation control in more modern versions of Access, then you've got an extra thing to do as well, which I may not have time to do today. Otherwise, then you just increase by the scaling factor. Once you've done that, you then look at each control in turn, and you do additional things as well. If it's got a font inside there, text box, label, command buttons, toggle buttons, or navigation buttons, then you scale up the font by the same factor. You see how important this scaling factor is there. If it's a list box, you do the same, but you also increase the column width proportionally. If it's a combo box, do exactly the same thing, but also the list width is increased proportionally. And if it's a tab control, there you change the width and the height of the tabs if they've been set as well. And having done all of that, we then go back to here, and then we do a little bit more. If there's zoom code involved, then you do something extra as well, and you also check whether or not it's a tab document or overlapping windows. There used to be a problem with the layout in tab documents that's fixed very simply by this code here. On to the next one. Zoom form code then. We start off by resizing the form. Let's ignore this stuff, that's specific to the form I've got here. We then check its resolution, and we do some additional things here. We're setting the slider value, checking what the user's default value is, and so on. And if the default value is different from 100, then it scales up proportionally in exactly the same way. So we've got a zoom scaling factor in the same way. Moving across here, it then updates the form zoom, it recenters the form, it zooms the form by the proportional scaling factor it says here. Otherwise, pretty much the same as the old standard ResizeForm me bit. Okay, we change the form dimensions, and we also add scroll bars if the zoom factor is over 100%, and then we store it for future use. Stretch shrink code then, again pretty similar. Here though, in the form load event, we get the original size of the form and save it for future use, and then we resize it. The original size, then it checks the dimensions of each section and the width of the form, and we get scaling factors to use with that. We then use another bit of code called stretch shrink me, which is again pretty similar to what we've done before, variations on a theme there. And what this does this time is it actually resizes the window of the current form, and it changes the height and the width of each section in proportion. Exactly the same ideas, but it does this on the fly as you're moving the form here. And you've got a stretch factor, which I showed on the screen there, to resize it as necessary. You'll study that later in your own time. Datasheet form, this is different to the others. The standard code doesn't work on this. When I did this, I actually set the datasheet to open with a font size of 10 so you can see the effect more clearly, but you can normally set that in the ribbon there. And what we do here is, as long as it's not a subform, then the font size is set as that. Then, however, we multiply up by the current scaling factor, use SNG factor elsewhere there. You then want to adjust the column widths automatically, and by using the value -2, it will automatically set the width of each column to be what you actually need it to be, to make sure all the text fit. And you only want to do this with controls that actually do contain a font, otherwise you will get an error 438. In the main form code, I've got some similar code to before, which I zoom things and I resize things according to need. There's a lot more to it. To understand this properly, you'd need to read this in detail and do some experimenting, but you get enough information by looking at my website for the dedicated page related to this, and on there you will find that it's actually got resources that go with this video. And you can see then there is the automatic form resizing app that I showed you earlier. I've got those 3 example databases that I use as tests here, but there's also links to my series of articles on form resizing, which there's 4 of those, the first one of which looks like that, and each one of those goes through different aspects of the code in some detail. Okay, it's been a long video. I'm going to stop here. Thanks ever so much for watching. There will be more Access videos to follow, and if people want me to concentrate on specific areas of this in more detail, I'm happy to do some further videos in the future. But for now, if you found it useful, please click the like button, leave a comment, do subscribe, you'll be notified when any new videos are uploaded, and do suggest any topics you want for future videos in this series. Thanks again, I'll see you soon.